All right, this video is going to introduce some of the reasons why it's important to have established ethical principles for research that's done with human subjects. And then I'll cover some of the central ethical principles that have been developed and enshrined in laws and professional codes since World War II. Now, you probably heard this quote, but it said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." A lot of the ethical principles that we hammer home so hard to budding researchers today are a result of historical ethical failures. Sometimes those failures were downright monstrous, coming from seeing others as less human or less deserving of rights and protections. Other times, it came because scientists were just so hungry to find the truth, the scientific truth, that they neglected the human costs. That's a reason why modern ethical review boards often involve non-scientists today, along with scientists. Now, some of the most chilling examples of scientific research were discovered after the end of World War II, when the Allies found out that the Nazis had been experimenting on human subjects in brutal and inhumane ways. So just for example, the Luftwaffe wanted to better understand how to treat hypothermia, which might sound like a high-minded pursuit of medical progress, until you realize they did this by doing research on prisoners who did not consent and who suffered greatly, sometimes being left for hours in ice baths or forced to stay outdoors in freezing weather while naked. Or in Ravensbrück concentration camp for women, where the Nazis conducted horrible experiments on dozens of women, mostly Polish, who were prisoners. So for example, they wanted to test things like sulfonamide, that's a drug for its antimicrobial properties. Again, medical research that may lead to all sorts of good in the world from what we learn, except for the fact that knowledge was only gained by forcefully experimenting on prisoners who did not consent. Indeed, they didn't wait around to try the treatment on people who already had infected wounds. They outright caused the wounds. They inserted bacteria into those wounds, and they even aggravated the wounds with putting glass in there and rubbing it around. So just horrific stuff of human experimentation. But before you go thinking this kind of perversion of science is something only done by villains like the Nazis, the United States has its own disgusting history of experimenting on people, at the time who were considered less than. So for example, the Tuskegee syphilis study was a famous study, long-term study, conducted by the United States Public Health Service and the CDC, who wanted at the time to study the effects and progression of syphilis when it was left untreated. So they enrolled hundreds of poor people, mostly black sharecroppers who were poor in Macon County, Alabama. They had around 400 unknowingly carrying syphilis, so people who had syphilis, and then 200 who served as a control group who didn't have syphilis. And these largely uneducated participants were told that they had bad blood and promised free medical care for participating in what they thought would be a 6-month study. But they were never actually told they had syphilis, even though the researchers knew what it was. And the study ended up going on not for 6 months, but for 40 years. A lot of them were given placebos, so fake treatments, without knowing they were placebos. Because at the time, some of the established treatments for syphilis actually had really major side effects and risks. They may not have worked. So this way, the researchers could see if no treatment was better than the old risky ones. And they could see where syphilis goes if it's untreated. But where it gets even more messed up is by the late 40s, penicillin was known to cure, not treat, but cure syphilis, and it had become the standard treatment. But these men in the study were not given it. They could have been cured, but instead researchers kept collecting data into the goddamn 70s on these victims. More than 120 of the men died from syphilis, either directly or from its complications, and 40 had infected their wives, leading to almost 20 kids in the study born with syphilis. A leak to the press about all this in the early 70s thankfully ended the program. It led to a report called the Belmont Report that has then led to the setup of all sorts of legal protections and oversight for any human subjects research in the United States. Even so, the U.S. government didn't officially apologize until Bill Clinton in the 90s. Now, that's not the only, horror story from research in the United States. Some nasty things were done in the name of social science as well. So, for example, the so-called monster study at the University of Iowa back in the 30s. This was a speech pathology study, and they used 22 orphans as the participants, some of whom had a stutter and some of whom didn't. Now, none of the kids knew what the study was really about. They were just told they were going to receive speech therapy. And for months, one set of kids in the study, so one group One set of kids was assigned to this group where they received positive feedback. They were praised for their verbal ability. But another set of kids was randomized into a different group, the second group, where kids were belittled for every speech imperfection and made to basically feel bad or like they would always have trouble with words. Of the kids who had started the study stuttering, the stutterers at the start of the study, receiving the negative treatment made things worse, and they suffered psychological effects, like lasting psychological effects. And of the children who hadn't studied before, some in that negative group actually developed new speech problems. And in some cases, this lasted throughout their lives. So we're talking real harm was done to these children, all in the name of determining scientifically what treatments might work for stuttering. And then there are the studies of Harry Harlow, who did a lot of work, mostly with monkeys, to support the attachment theory of John Bowlby. So you may have heard of him if you're a psychology major or have read about attachment theory at all. At the time, in the 1930s and 40s, behaviorism dominated psychology, and parents and doctors alike applied principles of classical and operant conditioning to better raise their children, like the advice you would read in scientific books, things like that. So for example, if the child cries, giving it attention would just be positive reinforcement of the crying behavior. So the advice at the time was stop rewarding crying behavior with your attention and instead ignore the baby. That way the unwanted crying behavior will go extinguish, we say in learning psychology, but it'll decrease, right? The behavior will go away. At the time, popular kind of quote unquote scientific parenting advice was actually to minimize physical contact with the baby in order to avoid spoiling them. So you would see quotes in advice and things like that, like babies under 6 months old should never be played with, and the less of it at any time, the better for the infant. Or John Watson, the famous psychologist's advice to never hug and kiss them, never let them sit in your lap. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when they say goodnight. Shake hands with them in the morning. So nurseries and orphanages were often dominated at the time by pretty sterile and minimal contact condition for the kids. And there was debate at the time about things like the role of mom or the caregiver in a baby's life. Like clearly there's a bond, right? Like a mother-infant bond. Was the bond between them mostly formed because mom is a source of food, or more because mom is a source of like security? It was widely thought at the time, both by behaviorists and Freudian psychoanalysts, that the primary role initially was as a source of nourishment, that infants became attached to persons that provide them food. It's one of those rare instances where the Freudians and the behaviorists agreed. They thought the mother-infant bond started as like a food source thing. Well, John Bowlby had come along and argued infants form an emotional bond of attachment with their primary caregiver, providing a sense of security, a kind of secure base from which to explore the world and which to return. Harry Harlow, the researcher at the time, tested this using monkeys as an animal model. So in his famous studies, he did things like separate these newborn monkeys from their mothers and then put them in a room where they're provided with the option to spend some time with two, you might call it simple sort of fake mother-like objects. So one of those objects provided food, and the other kind of fake mother object provided comfort. And he wanted to see which they would spend more time with. And in short, he found that the monkeys preferred to spend time at the comfort blanket version of the surrogate mom rather than the one that provided food. So he had shown that contact comfort is critical to developing attachment between infant and caregiver, contrary to the previous, psychoanalytic assumption that mom equals food. And there were quite a few other experiments he did along the same line, showing that like the cloth mother served as a secure base from which to explore the world and run back to when you're scared, other things that we now take for granted in child development theory. He even did an experiment dubbed the Pit of Despair, where monkeys suffered total social deprivation, and in turn they developed severe psychological problems, like they'd be rocking back and forth, they'd be self-harming, extreme stress, trouble interacting with others later. Yet ironically, from these horrific studies did come a new understanding of how important physical contact is for infants, something that had not been widely accepted prior to that. And as a result, orphanages, social service agencies, and hospitals all altered critical policies based on his results. So they started treating infants and babies better. Ironically, despite abusing these monkeys, his work did bring like a warmth to the way we parent infants. What seems really obvious to us now, right? This seems crazy. Like, of course, it's so obvious, but it was not necessarily obvious and accepted in the early to mid 1900s. So we've seen that research can be done even perhaps sometimes with good intentions or helpful knowledge gained in some cases, but that research that may involve doing great harm to people, or to, in Harry Harlow's case, to animals. But by learning about these incredibly troubling examples, we realize that scientists are not always benign and can't always be trusted to act morally or police themselves. Hence, these and other historical wrongs have led to a number of laws and regulations, both nationally and internationally, to govern how research is done. And that's with human subjects, also with animal subjects. Likewise, organizations like the American Psychological Association, or APA, has its own guidelines on top of the legal standards that are in place. So in the next video, let's talk about those ethical principles that are now in place for anyone doing research with human subjects.